There are few system games out there that can really call themselves among the oldest of the TTRPG engines, and today we are going to be going a bit more in depth into one of them. Hello everybody, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Haskins County for another TTRPG Talk. This video series takes a look at tabletop role-playing games and related materials and game design. Today we're going to be continuing our SRD series with a look at the new version of the Basic Role-Playing game engine, specifically the version that was recently released, and I did a little unboxing video for, by Chaosium Games. This is a significant update of what was originally presented in the Great Golden Book, which was sort of like the first, essentially an SRD that they had created, gaming engine. And this is a full-blown engine description document that you could use essentially on its own to run a game. It contains a lot of materials within it that can help you do that. But of course, it also in itself operates, with the exception of the couple of terminology elements in here that are trademarked, of course, as its own fully licensed, freely licensed SRD. First, let's talk a little bit about the history of basic role-playing. First of all, it's important to note that this has, of course, been created and continues to be used and operated by Chaosium Games. Chaosium had originally sort of developed the beginnings of what would become basic role-playing as a part of the different games that they've created, specifically with sort of the original versions of RuneQuest, but it has evolved to be utilized in a number of different games, including Call of Cthulhu, which has been particularly popular recently. Pendragon, which recently had a new edition come out, has a modified version of the sort of basic role-playing engine in it. Modern versions, obviously the original versions of RuneQuest used basic role-playing. RuneQuest then bounced between different developers and has used a number of different systems over the years, but has, since its return to Chaosium, it has returned to utilizing a basic role-playing, like full-blown. And then, of course, Chaosium had released a set of World of Wonder set, which is actually kind of similar to the sort of what's old is new system of games that was released for the Wine engine. In that particular, in the Wine set, there is a old sort of either medieval or medieval low fantasy, or you could use it for high fantasy. There is a futuristic sci-fi version, and then a sort of modern setting. In the Worlds of Wonder that was created by Chaosium, there is a fantasy world, future world, sci-fi, and then a super world, which is essentially modern day, but you have like superheroes and stuff like that in it. Obviously, a number of other companies have released games utilizing the system, including, for example, I have this one here, which is, as you can see, Basic Role-Playing Rome, which was released by LFTAR Games. I don't know. I picked this up in a bundle or a humble bundle on something somewhere. But there's a number of other ones out there that have either adapted the basic role-playing basic concepts and structure of its gaming, or have utilized the engine wholesale in their own games. So let's go ahead and dive a bit into the legalities here. So obviously that's something we're going to want to do pretty early, because you're probably here because you want to know whether or not you can use this. Well, the basic role-playing, this manual that recently came out, the actual engine can be utilized by you under the ORC license. Now, as a creator, many ways, the orc license, from my understanding of it, is actually relatively similar to, when it comes to effectively utilizing it, to like a commons attribution license. In that, obviously, you need to attribute the fact that you're utilizing it. You have to say that you're utilizing it under the orc license. You can use it for personal or commercial use without any problems there. Obviously, there are a number of things in here that you're not allowed to use. So, for example, don't use the pictures. You're not allowed to utilize or reproduce, artwork, illustrations, trade dress, graphic design, all of that kind of stuff as you normally would. Hello, Editing Essen here. One thing that I forgot to mention in this section of the video is that Orc License also has a share-alike component in it. Essentially what it means is that anybody who creates material based off of another item that already utilizes the Orc License, they also have to use the Orc License. So for example, if you created a game utilizing Basic Roleplaying with this Basic Roleplaying Universal Engine, you would have to then put an Orc License on your own product. One admitted advantage of this is that anybody creating something based on your materials would then also have to use the Orc license, and so on and so forth down the line. That also includes having to then legally cite anybody who has utilized the Orc license upstream of you. So somebody created an adventure based on your game. They would then have to use the Orc license for their adventure and would have to cite both your game and a Chaosium's basic role-playing engine so that that chain is maintained. So it also helps create a genealogy, let's say, of game creation. Now, obviously, there's a lot of stuff in here that you might not want to use because while the basic rules don't actually cover that many pages, there's tons and tons of supplemental stuff in here from the various different products that Chaosium and other people have made using basic role playing that obviously that you're not going to want to use all of it all at once. So now, of course, we come to the question, what are the basic rules of what are the basic elements that make the basic role-playing engine? What makes it different from other systems? Well, first of all, one thing that's important to consider is the fact that basic role-playing is a D100 based system. There are a number of other D100 systems out there, one or two of which I've actually covered before, or have utilized in some of my own games, so you can definitely take a look at some more information there. But in this instance, specifically what we're doing is we are rolling a D100 and we're attempting to roll under the value that we have. Should we roll significantly under, there is a chance of getting some of critical success if you want to incorporate that in. If you roll significantly above, then there is a chance that if you roll very much above, you might fumble, which might have its own consequences. As a part of that, basic role-playing has characteristics and it has skills. Skills are certainly a very strong element of this, in that skills are oftentimes when your character is actually doing stuff, skills are going to be the item that's utilized more frequently when your character is the active player, the actor in the situation. If your character is acting in a situation where you don't have a skill for, or if your character is more the receiver rather than the actor, then oftentimes you're going to be utilizing your characteristics more. Or if this is a thing where it's just like a raw check of your own physical or mental abilities, then there might not be a need to utilize a skill. In any case, so you up there and the sort of around here, you have your characteristics. This lists all of the different characteristics. You obviously don't need to utilize all of these. The big ones are strength, constitution, intelligence, dexterity, and charisma. That probably sounds really familiar. Those obviously are characteristics utilized in a lot of different places. There is also a size characteristic. That's because strength and size kind of combine together to help create how many hit points you should have and stuff like that. Um, there are a number of other ones, though, that might be useful for depending upon the different settings that you have. There is a powers characteristic. This is, of course, the type characteristic that you would usually utilize that would be attached to if your setting or game has magical powers, supernatural powers of some sort. So, for example, powers might be useful in a Call of Cthulhu game or in a superhero game or high fantasy, stuff like that. Another one that is included on this page that is particularly useful for modern or future sci-fi games would be education. So education might be a trait, a characteristic that is familiar to people who are used to playing things like Traveler. Um, and actually, now that I think about it, thinking of Traveler, social class might be another characteristic that you might need to integrate into your game, depending upon the setting, especially if your setting has very strict um, social levels or social norms. Not necessarily, I'm not necessarily going like to the point of like a caste system, let's say, but let's say there's like very the characters who are potentially going to be interacting with each other could be on very different social levels, very different levels on the social hierarchy of your setting, um, and that the social hierarchy is pretty spread apart. And so that might be very useful, especially in those kinds of situations. So maybe for like a medieval game, or like I mentioned, a game where they're very strong and strict sort of social levels and interactions with each other. Like let's say a game that has a similar setting to, let's say, Dune, where it's sci-fi but still feudal. Um, that might be another place that's useful. Basically, all of those characteristics will have a score. If you need to roll to see like how well you do, and basically like a check, like a raw check of those characteristics. So, for example, the effort, putting a large amount of strength and effort into something, uh, trying to come up with a new idea, all of those would be your characteristic times 5. And then that would set the percentage that you're trying to roll under. So underneath that sort of top slot that you see up here in this big giant box down here, we of course have our skills. These are some basic skills that are listed here, some of which might be applicable to your setting or not. In other parts of the book, they also have a large list of other skills that might be relevant to a particular style of game, setting, that might be useful for you to potentially apply to certain situations. Now, one thing that is different about basic role playing and some other systems is that you don't like gain experience points that you then can just kind of spin willy nilly wherever you want. That's not exactly how experience works in this. Basically, whenever you utilize a skill in play in such a way that the GM would feel that your character would have potentially learned from that situation, then you would actually gain. You would you would put like a mark in this checkbox next to it, and then later on when you hit like a pause point in sort of your campaign, whether that's at the end of the session or maybe at a major rest, where like time's advancing a bunch or stuff like that, then you would potentially increase your percentage in that skill. So essentially, you are learning by doing, which of course provides an incentive for your character to potentially utilize skills that they're not necessarily that well advanced in, because then it provides an opportunity to improve that skill further anyway. In this system, we also have you can basically gain experience in certain things by training or formal learning, which would be more of basically off camera, off stage sorts of things kind of happening in between times and basically during downtimes, your character might practice certain things outside of actual practical application in game. So earlier, when we were taking a look at the character sheet, you will have noted that I had talked about, instances where we are rolling and your character is utilizing a statistic or your character is utilizing a skill. In both of those situations, of course, your character is essentially acting by themselves against the world. Now, obviously, there are situations where that might not necessarily be the case. So, for example, another possibility is that you're attempting to roll a resistance roll. In this case, basically, you are attempting to act in opposition to some sort of passive resistance that is making your life difficult, like you're trying to break open a stuck door, right? So in this instance, basically, you would be matching your strength against whatever the resistance rating of that thing would be. So, for example, as you can see here in the picture, we've got two people arm wrestling. This is another situation where you could potentially use resistance rolls instead of the standard opposition rules. But in this case, basically, let's say my character strength is 14. Let's say the resistance of the item is the door is 9. So I'd need to roll a 75 or less, which is pretty easy to do, right? Then you got like three-fourths odds there. Whenever you are having, also, of course, you can have situations where, like, say, a PC or an NPC or even two PCs are in conflict with one another. In those situations, normally you'd essentially be rolling against each other, where basically whoever gets a succeeds or gets a higher level of success than the other person wins, um, but might have their wins degraded a little bit if the other person also succeeded, even if they lost the roll. Or, of course, we could do resistance like we just mentioned here. Whenever we are gaining assistance from another player. In a lot of other games, you might get an extra die, or you might get like a raw bonus if you just say, "Oh, I'm gonna help," and then that's it, right? In this instance, actually, the other person has to roll too. Um, when they do, basically, if you succeed or gain some other level of success, right, like a special success or a critical success, essentially, if you roll a success, then you're boosting the skill or attribute rating of the other person by a certain amount, usually 20%. If you a special success would be 30%, critical success would be 50%. But if you fail, then that means that you're actually reducing their skill. Um, or at least if nobody succeeded, you're potentially reducing it. Of course, it's also important to remember that you can always modify rolls based on the complexity of the task, whether you've got equipment to help you, things in the environment, how familiar you are with this item or this thing or whatever you're trying to do. All of these, as you can see in this table here, would also potentially increase or decrease the attempt rating, usually by like 20 if it's just like uh, a moderate inconvenience or a moderate challenge that's making this thing more difficult. And if it's really difficult, then you're increasing it, or making it really easy, then you're increasing it or decreasing it by an extra 50% instead of just 20%. Another thing that's important to note when it comes to the basic role-playing game engine, this isn't something specific to the rules of the engine, but more just an advantage of the actual specific text itself. There is a settings chapter that does go into detail in some optional rules that do exist in certain systems associated with different basic role-playing games that Chaosiums has made. So, for example, we have optional roles in association with allegiance. This is something that particularly is connected to, I think this comes from RuneQuest, because you can have allegiance to certain gods and stuff. But of course, there are other ways that you could potentially utilize this to give your character like an allegiance score to certain things. And of course, once the more you get more points to certain things, it makes it easier to do certain uh, gain certain benefits or stuff like that. So you could use this as a faction system, or again, gods. Or like affiliations or associations with certain other powers or elements within your game world, um, whatever that might be. Another thing is passions. So, of course, characters are have certain strong emotions, certain strong things that they might need to do. Um, Things that influence their characters' actions and stuff. So basically, these passions are things that you can give ratings to, just like skills or stuff like that. And basically, they're things that mechanically advantage certain actions. Basically, they make it more likely that your character will act in a certain way, because basically, if you're acting in opposition of your character's passion, then you're probably going to need to roll to see if you manage to succeed or not, and kind of acting against that passion, or acting in a disadvantaged thing. So, for example, you might have great hatred towards something, or you might have a great fear of something, right? Let's say my character is deathly afraid of, I don't know, spiders, um, to the point where I would make it a passion because spiders are a significant thing in this world. Um, let's say giant spiders are a significant enemy, just like wolves, they're everywhere. Um, Maybe my character so therefore my character coming into contact with spiders would have to potentially overcome their passion, their fear of spiders, in order to be able to do certain things. Another thing that is recommended is there might be a reputation system. um, this would be measuring your character's fame, notoriety, renowned. In some ways, this could also kind of tie into what I mentioned previously, where you could make a characteristic, and that's your social level. Here you go. You could use reputation as a type of social level. Um, Again, this could be increasing or decreasing or whatever, based on certain actions that you do, impressing other people, and then gain certain things from that. And of course, obviously, another optional rule that we have in associated with basic role playing is the sanity system that is directly from Call of Cthulhu. So unless you're dealing with like a horror game or something that involves like weird eldritch occult mind twisty sort of things, this is probably not something you would necessarily need to use, because essentially it's attempting to mechanize mental trauma. When we were talking about characteristics, I mentioned that there was a powers score. A powers characteristic. Well, there's an entire chapter in the book talking about different scopes of power that might exist in your world. Some of these might exist in your world, some of them might not. Some of them might exist together, so you might just have one. Um, but either ways, there are several different systems here that you can kind of either operate as, they call them power sets, that you could potentially utilize in your world. So those are magic, mutations, um, psychic abilities, sorcery, and superpowers. So I'm not going to go into the specifics of what we have here, but yeah, there's lots of different skills, mutations, psychic powers, and stuff that are been incorporated into and included here, um, of different ratings and stuff based on how powerful it is, how many points it might use. Because of course you might want to use a point by system, or you might have the roll system. Um, for like sorcery and stuff like that, because you don't have to roll to use them, you might want to utilize a point by system, um, where your powers is like a your powers sets a pool, and then you spend out of your pool. Um, you might want to utilize that depending upon how magic works in your world or how superpowers work in your world. Maybe the more you use them, of course, the weaker you get. It's harder. You has to use energy of some type, right? And that's another thing that might influence how your powers work in your game. And I think that's all that we'll try to cover today. Basic role playing is definitely a system that is distinctly different from your typical D20 system. It's definitely different and very distinct when it comes to roles, and then also when it comes to uh, gaining experience and stuff like that. That in many ways feels very yes, it's very distinct from things like D&D or other games that kind of came out around the same time period. Um, would I use it? I think it would definitely be useful in certain situations and would definitely be a good engine to at least try out things with, especially because basic role playing is pretty adaptive, especially with the way the skill and this way the skill system works and the fact that you can drop in and out powers and stuff like that. It's a good experiment with and play around with, especially if you're creating your own sort of homebrew rules setting or game, because it it allows you to more easily potentially swap things in and out. If let's say you're playing a game, your character you guys your gaming group wants to play a game in a different setting, I'll just switch out the setting. You can potentially even use the same characters depending upon what sorts of powers or other optional rules you might be swapping in and out. So there's that. On the other hand, there are also certain levels of complexity that some gaming groups might not necessarily want to utilize. For example, that big long list of skills, some gaming groups might not want that, in which case you might want to create a more sort of trimmed down list of skills. Um, another potential problem or another potential complexity that might be introduced by this system is the fact that you have skills and characteristics and that they're used in different situations and certain things. So, if you're creating a game, you might want to utilize one or the other or have a stronger connection, which there are some optional roles where you can have a stronger connection between your skills and characteristics. So there's that also. Um, Thank you all for joining us again here today at this look at basic role playing in our SRD series. Again, links will be found down below where you can get a hold of at least the PDF of the basic role playing game engine. Although if you go to the Chaosium's website, you can find it there. Have a good zone, and don't forget to rate your it purchases.
If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hessens County blog, in the description down below, you will find links to the channel coffee and also the itch store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.